Welcome to the Content Champion podcast. We provide the training and tools to help you become a content marketing champion in your online business. Introducing your host, the content champion himself, Loz James.
Welcome to the Content Champion podcast. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I'm delighted to introduce Simon Dunant, owner of digital marketing consultancy New Rise Digital and presenter of the Podcast Power Marketing podcast. With over 11 years experience in online marketing training, coaching businesses, creative artists and bloggers, Simon is also an author, conference speaker and course creator. And it's his latest course, Podcast Power Blueprint, that we're discussing today. Let's dive in. Thanks for coming on, Simon.
Hey, great to be on the show, Loz. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, as a fellow Brit online marketer, I'd love to hear how you got started in the industry, please.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So it goes back a little while, but like yourself, I actually started back in the 90s as a radio journalist. Obviously, I know you started in the radio industry as well, Loz. You've got a background there. But in the mid-90s, I came to the radio industry. I actually got trained by a real legend in the industry, a guy called Sid Burke, who was a leading light in the 80s and the 90s in the radio industry. He was a real leading light in LBC, but in the radio industry in general. And he was a real mentor to me. He taught me everything about storytelling. And that's where sort of I started learning the art of storytelling. I spent some time down in South London as a features journalist after my training in the radio industry. But my real passion was actually in the music industry. I'd always had a passion in the music industry since I was a kid, really. Started in guitar and then got into electronic music way back in the 80s and 90s. But in 2004, I actually started up as my own independent electronic dance producer, and I started a label. I started remixing. I ran my own production studio and my own record label. And I was living in Holland at the time, over in mainland Europe, and had a blast of a time for 6 years in the record industry. But more to the point, the reason that I got into the marketing industry was through the music industry, really. I became successful at promoting our tracks online in the very early days of online marketing, back in the days of MySpace, which of course sort of is no more in its form that it was back in then. You know, and just as iTunes was starting in 2006, I started working with other artists promoting their music online, because I kept getting asked all the time, how do you promote your music so well and how are you doing so well with it, that other music artists actually asked me to promote theirs. So it turned into from a record label and a production studio into a marketing business. I started up a music marketing business in 2006, and we started getting some great results for independent artists, because at the time record labels were really on their way down and independent artists were on their way up, a bit like the business scene with small businesses now. And we brokered some great deals in Europe for some US artists. We worked with some Universal record artists, and we got a top 20 Billboard chart hit in the US.
What was it?
It was Taylor Bright. This is a really funny story, Luz. I can't remember the name of the track now. It was so long ago, but it was an artist called Taylor Bright. She was a singer-songwriter. She was 16. She wanted to break into the US market. So we teamed up with a dance music producer, and we got her this top 20 dance music track in the Billboard charts, and she was just 16. And this is a really funny story, because people started asking her to come and do club promotion, and when she turned out the club, they couldn't let her in because she was too young.
Victim of your own success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that also took me across to mainland Europe, and I spoke and represented a lot of artists at MIDEM, which is in Cannes every year. It's sort of the equivalent to the film industry conferences that goes on in the film industry, but this is for the music industry. So MIDEM's a huge marketplace, and we did some deals there for artists, and I started speaking at places like MIDEM. We went to PopCom in Berlin, which is another big European conference and marketplace, and did some business there. But around about 2008, the recorded music industry that I was in really took a bit of a nosedive, because obviously, you know, online peer-to-peer file sharing and music, that whole
Napster.
Yeah, exactly. Napster killed the music industry. So, well, you know, it was always going to be like that. You know, the great Seth Godin predicted it in the publishing industry as well. And all digital media went that way. You know, radio's moving that way as well in terms of podcasting as well. But the key thing was I had all these transferable skills, the marketing skills that I'd learned, and been out in the Wild West, testing all this stuff, trying all this stuff, finding out what worked. So I started looking for new industries to take that to. So having a media background, I was obviously drawn to things like content marketing and stuff. And I've been podcasting for a while in the music industry, and also, around digital marketing and stuff for musicians. So I left the music industry in about 2009 and started up a new business digital marketing agency, New Rise Digital. Back then, it was just an idea, and over time, it's really blossomed and grown. I wrote a book on digital marketing in 2014 because, as I mentioned before, Seth Godin was predicting the same thing was going to happen in the publishing industry. So I jumped on the whole publishing bandwagon and got out a really successful book published through Amazon, The Essential Digital Marketing for Small Business. And that was a really new experience as well. So again, it was aligned to that whole self-empowerment of digital marketing. But then bringing it right up to date, last year, I started seeing through, some of the research I was doing on content marketing, some really interesting stats that were coming out of the podcasting arena. I started noticing podcasting appearing everywhere on the business scene. Edison Research started publishing their share of ear reports every year, every quarter. And that documented the rise in podcast listening. Now, basically before that, it was just radio figures that they were documenting, and podcasting really wasn't seen anywhere in reports. And in the UK specifically, Radar, the people who put together the figures for the radio industry in the UK, teamed up with Ipsos and Mori, the research people, and they do a quarterly radio market report as well. But that started including podcast figures as well. And I was like, wow, hang on, what's happening here in the podcasting industry? I knew it had been around for 10 years, but sort of by early 2015, I was thinking there's something happening here in the podcasting industry. So I started digging in a bit more. Being in the whole digital marketing arena with New Rise Digital, I was in a place to start setting up some research and stuff like that. So I noticed that businesses and entrepreneurs were picking up the podcasting format. I noticed that radio stations were suddenly moving to podcasting formats as well to extend their things like their newsrooms, but also, to add value to their existing live broadcasts. And more interestingly, newspapers and newspaper editors were extending their newsrooms to include podcasting as well, which was really interesting. I recently just saw actually now that the Financial Times has 45 million listeners to its podcast every year. I'm not sure what their circulation is in terms of paper, but obviously the publishing industry and the newspaper industry is on a downward spiral. So they're looking for new formats to move to. So I really saw something was changing in that industry. So I broke out a branch of New Rise Digital to focus on podcasting to figure out, hey, what's this market doing? And that brings me right up to date to last year and this year, which is starting up my podcast consultancy, Podcast Power Marketing, really to conglomerate all that stuff together, all that research, and also keep tracking it, but to also help content marketers and brands take advantage of that podcasting format, because that's where the biggest growth is going to be over sort of the next year, really.
That's amazing. You're really accomplished. It's really exciting what you've been doing. It's interesting because rather than having the old prescriptive media consumption model, now sort of everyone can play, as it were, and podcasting's really at the heart of that. Now, I know you've got a load of stats that'll get our mouths watering with regard to the podcasting landscape, particularly in the UK. So could you share some of those with us, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They are really interesting stats, and they're astounding stats. And actually, they're a little bit hidden, and this is one of my missions, is to bring these opportunities and stats to people that are hidden out there, because they're sitting over in the corner. But when you actually compare some of these stats to the stats that content marketers are working with now, they're phenomenal. They really are. The latest Edison research that came out in the first quarter of 2016 in their share of ear report this year showed that podcasting took a leap of 24% year on year in terms of growth. It's actually the biggest leap in the history of the format. And I think actually going back to what I said earlier about, that progression, and what you said, Loz, about the progression of the media industry and how it's really moving to and touching all parts of business now in terms of focusing on content marketing and business, it's the biggest leap in the history of the format because of that, because people are discovering it. There's 57 million people listening in the US to podcasts every single month. That's a massive amount of people that are listening. There's 100 million people that have reported that they've ever listened to a podcast. This recent quarter in 2016, Edison Research actually said that, podcasting is now a mainstream format. So, we really have got to that stage where we've tipped the balance. It's that tipping point where, podcasting is ubiquitous across all the digital media, whether it's, on a desktop, on a tablet, on a phone. And I think that's one of the reasons for the rise.
Traditional media outlets must be quaking in their boots with all this.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. It's that change again. It's that shift in movement, and I think we've seen enough of that now in the last 10 years as the internet has moved on into every aspect of business. In the music industry, it's moved the publishing industry, and now it's really moving the marketing industry as well. Just to give you some UK perspective, the UK is about 7% of the US market. So in the UK, you're looking at around about 4 million people at the moment listening to podcasts every month in the UK, from the latest Ray Jarman Ipsos latest figures. If you look at even a percentage of the growth that the US is seeing, you're going to see some of that mirrored here in the UK as well, if not more. So that it's definitely on a real big uptick curve. So that's the numbers. That's great, but who are the people that are actually behind the numbers? Who are the individuals? What are they like? What are the demographics? Content marketers always want to know that a lot about the people and the personas of the people that are actually listening. And there's a company called Midroll. They are an advertising company owned by a larger advertising conglomerate in the US. They actually deliver advertisements into very large podcasts with large audiences. So they have a big base size to measure the effectiveness of ads, and also to find out more about who's listening, who the type of people are listening to podcasts. And they actually released some amazing stats about their research. They had a base size of 168,000 people that they researched, which is a fair base size. And they found out that actually 88% of people who subscribed to a podcast listened to absolutely every single episode that was put out by that podcaster.
That's amazing, because that's brand loyalty there and then, isn't it?
Absolutely. Podcasts are super sticky. This is incredible. Nobody's ever really quantified this before. Midroll put this together. But having 88% of people listening to everything that you do, they're not dipping in and out. They're actually locked in, and they subscribe to a podcast, they get another podcast, they will listen to it. And yeah, as you say, brand loyalty, for the most part, the majority of podcasts that are out there in the iTunes ecosphere and stuff, many of them are personal podcasts, they might be, a few of them are brand podcasts, but many of them are journalist podcasts and stuff like that. So these people are all enjoying, a locked in listenership, which is absolutely phenomenal. But when we look at the commercial side of it, obviously Midroll are putting out advertisements, and they can obviously measure the response rates on those for keying the ads and stuff like that with special URLs and things like that. They actually found that when they asked people how many people actually purchased something from listening to a podcast, they found that 61% of people actually purchased a product or service because they heard a commercial message on a podcast.
So how does that work? Is that from a direct call to action within the podcast? Or is it that they've consumed the podcast and gone on subsequently to be influenced by that and made a purchasing decision further down the line?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. Ultimately, Midroll has the ad read by the presenter. So what they're actually doing is they're locking in to the trust that the presenter brings to the podcast. And going back to that 88%, if they're listening to every single podcast that you're putting out, they're building up a relationship with you, and they're locking in trust. And advertisers are tapping into that by putting, advertisements in through Midroll into these large podcasts. And of course, people who are listening to that influencer are going to trust that influencer already. So they're buying into basically the trust in the podcast. But I think the format also lends itself to that trust too, because if a brand is podcasting, then they're actually bringing a personality to their brand, and they're bringing a real human being to their brand, and they're tapping into that trust as well. So even if you don't have an advertisement in your podcast, if your brand is the advertisement and you're providing value to your listeners through education, information, whatever you're putting out through your podcast, as you well know, in the content marketing industry, that's the goal, is to put out value to your listeners, to track them in. You can tap into that stickiness, by being a commercial broadcaster effectively and setting up your own media channel. So I think, there's a bit of both, but certainly people are more receptive and sort of expect commercial messages. And I think that might come also from the heritage of podcasting being much aligned to radio. People have got used to commercial radio and hearing commercial messages as well and being influenced by that. So I think there's a lot of crossover historically from that too. But it's still a phenomenal amount of people that are happy to have commercial messages in the podcast. They actually find them helpful. I think it was one of the Edison research reports last year that actually reported that people said these advertisements and these commercial messages are actually helpful for people to find solutions to their challenges. It's not very often that in the advertising industry, people say that an advertisement is helpful.
It's incredible. Those growth stats kind of prove it. I'm certainly told that's why I'm here doing these podcasts. But if we want to build a loyal brand tribe, podcasting is the way to go. And we really need to become a brand publisher to do this, don't we? So in your podcast power blueprint, the course you've developed, you go through all the stages of setting up a successful podcast. And we're going to look at those steps now. So let's start with the essential equipment. We're going to need the right kit to get started, aren't we?
I think one of the key things is there is a lot of selection that you can make, but it isn't actually that difficult and it isn't that expensive to set up your own podcast anymore. You've got to look at getting the foundations in place. So for content marketers specifically, I think, you're going to be wanting to create the content and getting the creative stuff out there. So setting up all the technical stuff and building the foundations means that you can focus on creating and publishing that content. So that's the first key thing that you really want to work on. You want to work on getting the best quality equipment and setting it up with the least hassle. You can set up a really good quality USB mic. I'm actually using one called the C01U Pro microphone. It's a USB microphone. And basically, it's a one cable solution. You plug your headphones into the microphone. And as you can hear now, you get some great quality audio. And you're really ready to go. Of course, technology these days, we've all got a really powerful computer in our pocket. You can podcast on mobile, whether it's iPhone or Android, it doesn't really matter. There's a great little mic out there called the SmartLav Plus microphone. It's basically a tie clip microphone that you clip on your shirt. That's a fantastic quality microphone. You can just clip it on your shirt and you can start podcasting, plug it into your iPhone and start recording right away. So when you start looking at what equipment you might want to get, really it's pretty easy. Most of the mics are going to be all the same out there, the USB mics. If you follow a plan, you'll be set up in no time, and it's pretty cheap to do so. This particular mic, the Samsung C01U Pro, is actually just £60 on Amazon. So, it's a low cost investment. You're going to need a bit of audio editing software. The most popular audio editing software is Audacity. It's an audio editor which is free and downloadable from the web, and it does everything you'll ever need it to do. And it's very easy to get started with. And the only other things you really need is just a decent set of headphones and perhaps a mic stand to put your mic on. And that's really all you need to do to get set up. But the key thing is to focus on getting that set up well, set and forget, and then you can get on to obviously producing your podcast as well.
We don't need to overthink this and get hung up on the tech. Just get it done and then start thinking about the quality of the content you're going to produce.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's the key thing is what we're doing here is we're in the communications business. We want to use the audio format and all the benefits that it brings to get your conversation going with your listener. And the key thing is don't get too stuck on the technical stuff. A lot of people do, and it's something you have to go through once and then set it all up. But once you've done that once, that's it. I think in the last 10 years, podcasting has been a little geeky, as it were, and there's millions of people talking about this setup, that setup, etc. But when we're talking about doing this for a business, the key thing is really to set up a formula, to set up a plan. The technology is so good these days, it actually doesn't matter which mic you have. So get one set up and get going. And of course, with any project, when you're starting, the key thing is to get started, do something well, and just move forward. And don't aim for perfection. It's just keep moving. Because we need as content marketers to jump on this. There's about a year window here, I think, where there's a real golden opportunity. So getting started now and getting your podcast moving forward is a real opportunity, yeah, for sure.
You're listening to the Content Champion podcast, showcasing the training and tools you need to become a content marketing champion in your online business.
Okay, so great. We're ahead of the curve. Let's keep this moving then. The second part of the equation, after the equipment, planning your show, what format to use, where to get good quality guests. We need to outline all this in advance, don't we?
Yeah. So like any content marketing, whether you're creating a blog post or you're creating a podcast, basically, plan out your show. All the most listened to shows really are well-structured shows. They sound a little bit like radio programs. It's a better experience for your listener. A better experience for your listener means you get recommended. It means you get more listeners, which gets you more traction in things like iTunes and helps you rise to the top. You want to be thinking about building out some show templates and some structure, just in the same way as you might build out a template for your blog posts and structure for your blog posts. Get a good intro for your show. There's some great people out there. There's a company called Music Radio Creative who do some great intro jingles. So check them out for a good intro. You can build in, your commercial inserts and your calls to actions and your outros. You can even pre-record some of those and slot those in to have those ready. Because what you want to do is really concentrate on, the main event, which is the variable part, the different parts that you're going to insert in the middle of your podcast every time you publish. And the main feature can be a monologue, whether it's, like a talk radio show format, or you can bring in guests like you do on the Content Champion podcast, Loz. You have some great, interesting guests and that sort of chats over coffee effectively, like we're doing here, just brainstorming, bouncing ideas about. So that's your main event.
People ask me, how do you get guests? And to be honest, the secret is I write a really nice personal email after genuinely following their content online and say, look, I'm running this podcast. Would you like to come on? The benefits are these, and my audience can learn a lot from your experience, etc. And just being honest like that, I think about 9 out of 10 people come on.
Absolutely. I found the same thing, Loz. Really getting guests is much easier than you think, because really what you're offering is a channel for people to talk about their projects, to share experiences, to brainstorm. And also, we're in a sharing economy. The content marketing is a sharing economy. That's how you succeed at content marketing. The blogosphere has been around for a while now, and that's really worked well for content marketers to share that conversation. And I think podcasts are an extension of that. And when it comes down to would you like to come and have a chat on air, and you ask industry peers or suppliers or even current customers to come on and talk about things, they're always willing to do that. And you're right, 99% of people always say yes. I've only had 1 out of 10, as you say, really say, that's not for me, but that's probably because it's just not the right format for them. If you do really get stuck for potential guests, which is unlikely, there are, quite a few online PR sites that can connect you to guests in your industry as well. So even if you really can't conjure up more than sort of 1 or 2 people that you might want to interview, there are plenty of people out there that you can connect to in your industry. And there's plenty of sites out there that can help you do that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about podcasting in general. We're talking about your podcast power blueprint. The next stage is recording each show. We need to feel confident behind the microphone, don't we? And we need to have our recording software set up just right so we can record great episodes and hit the ground running.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a good word there, confidence. Obviously, I come from a radio background, and so do you, Loz. Some people might be new to the broadcasting industry and the podcasting industry. If you're sitting on a sofa or on a beanbag writing your latest 3,000-word blog post, okay, it's very all-encompassing, very me-focused medium. Getting in front of mic is a bit like getting up and standing up in front of people and doing, a talk at a conference, for example. For most people, that's one of the scariest things that they can do. But there's a lot of techniques that you can use for gaining some confidence when you're presenting a podcast. I mean, one of the key things is, think about podcasting as a conversation. You're going to be talking to people, which is what we do naturally. We've done it since the beginning of time. And that will bring you a lot of confidence when you come to actually conduct an interview online. There's a lot of things around posture as well that gets missed as well. Sitting up straight, smiling during your interview, those sort of things can be things that people don't always think about if they don't come from the broadcasting industry. And also mental preparation, right? Doing your planning and doing your preparation and just getting into the right frame of mind before an interview. Those are really key things to think about before you dive into an interview as well. And, once you've got all your equipment set up and you're confident with all that and you're practicing some good mic technique and stuff like that and not moving around too much, when you feel confident with your equipment and you're feeling good about yourself, you're going to dive in and the conversation is going to be, fantastic. And when people listen to that, they're going to really feel the essence of the conversation. And I think it's a human experience when you're having a conversation, and that's what comes over on podcasts. And I think that's why they're really popular at the moment.
You can just practice a bit beforehand too. If you feel really nervous, you can give it a dry run to yourself or someone else, just so that when you're actually doing it, you've got that to draw on. You can think, I can do this. I've done it before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, just, do a little intro about yourself, talk about 5 topics, maybe pick a blog post. If you want to practice, a great way of practicing for podcasters is to pick one of your most successful blog posts that's got the most traffic. Sit somebody opposite you and just go through and sort of ask them a few questions about it, do a little mock interview and set all that up first. And yeah, practice is the key. I think once you do your first podcast and you get your first guest, what happens is, and this happens with every podcaster I've spoken to, once they've done their first interview and they got their first guest, they feel so excited that right there and then they want to do their second one. It's like this elation. I call it the podcast elation. And they see how exciting it is and they feel that it was a really worthwhile conversation and that there's so much value packed into it that they immediately want to go and do another one. Everybody I've spoken to said that to me.
It's one of those things, podcasting, that once you've made an effort to get started, it really becomes something you quickly become very proud of. I think this is number 53 that I've done, and I love doing them and meeting new people like yourself and getting the benefit of your experience and sharing mine. And it becomes a body of work that you can stand behind, really. It, as a business, tells people who you are and what you're all about and what your business stands for. So you can say, look, if you want to know all about us, just have a listen to these podcasts because there's something we've really put a lot of effort into.
No, absolutely. It does position you as a thought leader, more so than something like a blog post, really, because it takes a lot more confidence to get on the mic and do this. It takes a little bit more effort, but it takes a lot more confidence as well. And I think if you do decide to do that, you're seen as a thought leader because, again, it aligns to similar to public speaking, but this is your own platform that you're building here. And some of the people that I've spoken to on our podcast, on the podcast Power Marketing Podcast, I interview new podcasters who've set up podcasters for their business. And they've all said that they've got speaking gigs because of it. I think it was Chloe Thomas from the e-commerce master plan podcast. She actually got invited out to Eastern Europe to keynote a couple of big conferences out there, purely because somebody had heard her on the podcast. She also got hired through the podcast. I hear all these stories all the time that there's these hidden things that people didn't think beyond just the value of the content they're putting out that would happen to them because they became a podcaster. I hear those stories every single day, yeah.
And to add to that, my personal experience, this podcast has been great in generating new business over the years. I know for a fact MDs of firms who've been listening to the podcast who've gone on to become clients. So it's so well worth doing. Okay, now we've looked at confidence on the mic, recording tech. What do you recommend in terms of software for recording our podcasts?
Yeah, so if you're doing interviews, obviously you can record them via Skype. There's a couple of free software tools you can use. There is free Skype recorder, which I use for audio. They have also a version for video as well, if you do want to do video podcasts. On the Mac, it's Ecamm, which is a great audio and video recorder for Skype. There's a new tool on the block, actually, which is really amazing. It's really just come out of beta. It's called Ringr, R-A-N-G-R. Now, this is an interesting tool because what it does is it actually allows you to record a conversation on a smartphone in an app. And basically what it does, it records both sides of the conversation. So if you call somebody up, it'll connect you like a Skype call. But what it will do is record your side of the conversation on your local smartphone and the other person's local conversation on their smartphone. Then what it will do is intelligently conglomerate those two together. It'll add those two together and send you the files over email. And what you get is basically as if you were both in the same room. That's some brand new technology that's come out. And I was following that. I interviewed Tim Smith, Tim, the head of Ringr, on one of my podcasts. And I remember listening to the beta and testing out last year. It was phenomenal. The tech industry is rallying around podcasting to build tools in every aspect of it to support this rising podcasting. Once you've recorded your interview, which you can do, really easily on Skype or on Ringr, then you want to sort of go through the editing process to make it a bit more polished, ready for publishing. When you're working with a podcast, you're editing audio, and it's a bit like editing a blog. You're still working with words, but you're actually working with an audio waveform which represents those words. It's actually a lot of fun, and it's really intuitive once you start getting used to editing a podcast. But what I would say is, rather than, I know most content marketers will start with like a wireframe for their blog, and then they will move pieces around. It's not actually as an intense editing process as editing a blog post because you're having a conversation, you've sort of planned a lot of it out beforehand. there isn't a great deal of editing that you really have to do for a podcast. You might have to top and tail it, take out some long pauses perhaps and things like that. But you're having a conversation, and what you want a podcast to be is a very natural conversation. You want to keep the editing, I always recommend, to a minimum. The biggest mistake new podcasters make is that they over-edit their podcast.
Yeah, I've been there.
We all have, absolutely. They take out every and they edit out every gap, and it doesn't sound like a conversation anymore. But that's what people are tuning in for. They're tuning in for that conversation. They're tuning in for that, to overhear a conversation as you would do in a coffee shop, for example.
This sounds great. Sounds better and better the more we talk about it, actually, because I didn't have a resource like your Power Podcast Blueprint when I started. I could have done with hearing advice like, you don't need to over-edit your podcast and things like that, because if you do edit too much, it just sounds like a couple of robots talking.
Absolutely. Yeah. You want to keep it natural. People are tuning in for the human experience. And, actually podcasting, I talk about this a lot. I should write a book about this. I talk about podcasting humanizing the web. And I think a lot of the media channels now are taking what used to be, a technically sterile medium that people used to connect through. And all of these apps, all of these formats are now effectively bringing people together into an experience. And I think that's what I was saying about not editing your podcast too much is keep the essence of that experience, because that's what people connect to. They connect to that humanness of podcasting. The same goes for video, really. But in podcasting, it's a lot more personal because, they're right up here in your ear and people are listening to it, while they're on the train and et cetera and stuff like that. So it's an intensely personal experience. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so just to recap the stages of podcasting, we've been through the equipment, the planning, the recording, the editing. Next up is publishing. So what do we need to do in order to get our podcast out there on our blog, on iTunes, Stitcher and Zune and other places like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So podcasting is works on technology the same way as blog posts do. It's based on RSS feeds, basically. So it's a push technology. I always describe it in this way. Your podcast is really your radio studio, and you're transmitting that out through an RSS feed, and you can connect that to effectively all these different radio receivers, effectively, that are iTunes, that are Stitcher Radio, as you mentioned. Obviously, setting up your feed at the beginning, the broadcast chain, effectively, the RSS feed, is really important. Once you set that up correctly, and you've got all the tech behind that set up, it's really a set and forget. And then every time you publish a podcast, just like as every time you publish a blog post, it gets pushed out through your RSS feed. And if you're connecting that RSS feed to places like iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and there's a lot of other platforms out there you can connect to, you're distributing your content to a lot of people. And these aggregators, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and other podcast platforms are also broadcasting that out to other platforms as well. So, in terms of networking, you can get to a lot of people really fast once you've set up your podcast feed. Some of the biggest aggregators, obviously, are iTunes. They're on all the iOS platforms. People listen to podcasts on their phones, on their tablets. They're now listening on Apple TV as well. And the next big thing that's happening, of course, is Apple CarPlay. As Apple are introducing podcasts, the whole ecosphere of Apple into the connected car, then there's huge opportunities for potentially radio to be sort of secondary. People who are selling cars want to have the latest in-car entertainment systems. It makes them more valuable to the market. And the rise of the connected car is really coming along. I mean, people are now even just connecting their smartphones into their car. If you've got an old car like I have, they're even using tape connectors to connect their iPhone into their car. But a lot of new modern cars now have Bluetooth as well that you can connect to as well. What's interesting is that recently one of the biggest podcast sharing applications, which is called Clamour, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well, which helps discovery of your podcast, that's actually now been approved into the CarPlay store. I think it's one of 16 apps that got added. So not only can you listen to podcasts through the native iOS podcast app in the car, you can also get a feed of snippets of new podcasts and discovery with Clamour. Now, if there's only 16 apps that have been approved in this CarPlay ecosphere, and 2 of them are for podcasts and audio, that says something about the power of audio that Apple are banking on, basically. Yeah. But really, what I think, Lance, is that podcasting, and this is the opportunity in terms of audio, is that podcasting gives you access to all these markets that if you're not podcasting, you didn't have access to. Going back to all those huge numbers of listeners that are coming to podcasting, that if you aren't podcasting right now as a content marketer is an untapped market. It's something that, your competitors others may well be doing, and tapping into that extra number of people and those engaged and affluent people. But if you're not doing it, you're missing out on that uptick of people. Yeah, so for sure. There's a couple of other little tips as well. If you are distributing a podcast feed, I did a little experiment and went around looking for some of the other alternatives to iTunes and Stitcher, because once you've done that, where else do you put your podcast? There's actually a website called player.fm, and I was putting the podcast feed on a lot of places, and then suddenly on a couple of podcasts that I produce, I saw a massive uptick of traffic, and I was thinking, where's all this traffic coming from? Suddenly, it was like 50, 60 a day suddenly. Just the whole stats on my media host just went ballistic. And I dug into the stats, and I found that it was all coming from Player FM. They seem to have a massive audience that they've built up over a long period of time. So I would say, as well as putting it on iTunes and Stitcher Radio and putting your feed out there on that, Player FM is definitely one to drive some traffic as well. So that's a little tip. And I also recently interviewed, I think it was Bo York from a new app called Satchel. They are actually building an app that helps podcasters get discovered locally, which for me is a whole new twist on this. They actually geolocate podcasts in their app when you get listed in there. So you can find podcasts in your local area. And that's a new twist on that, because obviously podcasting has a huge reach, and it can be global and it can be massive. But also if you're a small local broadcaster on podcasting, then you can also target it locally as well through apps like Satchel as well. So some really exciting times ahead, thanks to all these developers that are really pushing forward podcast discovery. It's going to be a lot of exciting stuff coming out in the next 12 to 18 months on discovery and social sharing of podcasts. That's the next big thing that's coming.
It is exciting, isn't it? For those businesses listening who want to start their own podcast, there's a kind of window now, and the stats you mentioned earlier about the reach of podcasting, it seems to me there's a great opportunity to get in now at the ground level and start building your podcast and having those brand conversations before the landscape gets too saturated, especially in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the UK now. This is the biggest opportunity here in the UK. I think it's much more mature in the US. People have really took to it in the US. But in the UK, the market is really wide open. It's as you say, it's an incredible trust builder. It's a sticky format. It's, an engaging medium. I think, like you say, we've got a saturation of blogs that is really hard to make an impact on. I mean, I spoke to Josh Cobb. He was on our very first podcast. He was from Australia. And that's actually a similar market to the UK. It's just getting started in the whole podcasting arena. He started up a real estate business, and he started a podcast as one of his first marketing channels. And, in the first few months, he got 25,000 listeners. He got feedback on his business, and he started actually developing his business based on feedback from listeners that were listening to his podcast and striking up conversations through comments, through iTunes feedback and stuff like that. And he actually built his business based around that podcast, which went on to be hugely successful, and started developing his products and stuff around that. Yeah, absolutely. It's a real window of opportunity over the next year now that we're really mainstream. Yeah.
Now, look, we've been discussing your podcast Power Blueprint, Simon, which I'm a member of, and it's superb stuff. It's the course I wish I'd really created myself on podcasting. And I guess the reason many people are listening in is because they want to set up their own podcast too. So we've got a very special offer for you if you want to join this course today, with some extra special bonuses if you take action now. So Simon, could you tell us what we get access to in your training area on the course, and outline your special Content Champion bonuses? And after that, I'll add in some of my own for loyal listeners of this show.
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically what I wanted to achieve with the Podcast Power Blueprint is I love coaching and training. That's one of my passions. I love watching people succeed. I love people harnessing the opportunities that are out there and really connecting with people. The Podcast Power Blueprint came about because that's what I wanted to do. I want other people to take advantage of those opportunities. So I built this course. It's 5 modules, 20 lessons, and 49 individual tutorial videos that takes you step by step, end to end, from the whole process. Much of what we talked about in the podcast today, from the technical side to the confidence side to the editing and the publishing and stuff like that. I also got a training community there as well, so that people can ask questions, Facebook group there as well. There wasn't really any standout resources here in the UK for content marketers who wanted to podcast. They were all having to piece bits together from everywhere, and a lot of it was very US-centric, and, it was very confusing. So, I wanted to put that together with, things like checklists, ebook resources to really give people a focus, to get all that technical stuff out of the way, and then guide them through the process of getting it started so that they can really concentrate on what's important, which is getting their communication communications out to their customer. So that's the course that we put together in the Podcast Power Blueprint. We've also got some ongoing videos on an ongoing basis, because the podcasting industry is changing on an ongoing basis as well. So we want to keep you up to date every month on the new progressions. So we've got some new webinars every month as well, keeping you up to date on all the techniques. But specifically for the Content Champion podcast listeners, Loz, we've got something extra that we've put together on top of the training course that will get you started. When you come to create your podcast through the Podcast Power Blueprint training process, you're at the point then where you need to launch it. It's like, okay, how do we launch this into the world? How do we make a real impact and start, building that customer base? So I put together 3 great bonuses as well that I think will really help for the launch process. Firstly, obviously, we're going to guarantee you an interview on the Podcast Power Marketing podcast, so you can talk about your new podcast and why you started it. So, that's the first bonus. We want to get you involved in the podcasting community and get people listening to your podcast and start getting those listeners coming through and building up your iTunes stats. We're also going to feature you on our blog at the Podcast Power Marketing website about the brand that your brand, your content marketing work that you're doing and the podcast that you've created, so that people know that you're starting to become a thought leader and you're out there in the industry showing that you're forward thinking and ahead of the curve. And also, I put a launch promotion package together as well for your podcast, including a press release distributed through our online news partners and news feeds that we've built up over the last 5 years, plus social media promotion on all of our social media channels when your podcast launches. So, that's on top of all the amazing training that you're going to get just by joining the course. We want to make sure that your podcast, when it's created and we've trained you how to podcast, is launched, and you've launched that rocket ship, you've lit the touch paper, and you're off.
That's amazing, Simon. I wish I'd had this resource when I started, quite frankly. Okay, my exclusive bonuses to add to that. 1, an honest iTunes review for your new show when it's published. 2, a high-value, half-hour Skype consultation on anything you want to ask me about podcasting, content marketing, or copywriting. Plus, number 3, promotion of your new show to my 35,000 plus social media followers. So that's everything Simon outlined in the course, his 3 bonuses, and my 3 bonuses too. Now, to take advantage of this offer now, this is what I want you to do. Visit www.contentchampion.com/power podcasting and follow the simple instructions there on how to redeem those bonuses after you've purchased. That's www.contentchampion.com/power podcasting.
Yeah, appreciate those bonuses as well there, because the key thing that I'm really passionate about is getting content marketers ready for this opportunity. It's a golden opportunity. We've got a year ahead where, we can really take advantage of this. And the people that get in to this market today are the people that are going to be succeeding 12 months down the line. And I really want to support this, and I really want to help people do it the right way and really benefit from the advantages that podcasting are going to take. So, I want to hold their hand through that process and genuinely make sure that they succeed in this. And that's the point of view where I'm coming from here. And with all those bonuses, Loz, every podcast that's going to be launched through this whole program and everything that we're doing here today, it's just going to be, and podcasting also has a huge impact on people. I don't think people realize this when they start a podcast. From a human aspect, you've got people listening who are being informed, they're being educated, and they're growing, okay? And those people on the other end that you're educating and listening, whether it's through a brand or whether it's even through a personal podcast, you're actually making a difference to their lives. People are going out and doing different things. They're making a better life for themselves, or they're growing a brand so that they can help other people. I'm very passionate about being growth orientated and making a difference to other people's lives, because that's ultimately why we're all here. And whether you're podcasting for a brand or whether it's a person, for a personal experience, I think many podcasters miss the fact that there's a listener on the other end that's actually going through a change and is being affected by that. And that makes a huge impact on the rest of the world, and it makes the rest of the world a better place as well. So that's an added benefit of podcasting too.
Okay, fantastic. So if you're listening to this show and you want the insider podcasting information that me and Simon both wish we'd had when we started, then sign up for the Podcast Power Blueprint and all those exclusive bonuses at contentchampion.com/power podcasting.
Wait for it, listeners. Here comes the PS question.
Now, before you go, I'm not letting you off the hook. Could you please share one advanced content marketing or podcasting tactic we can use right after the show?
Okay, yeah. So one thing I wanted to mention as well is about repurposing. Podcasting is fantastic for repurposing. If you do have a podcast already, I'm gonna add a whole bunch of value here. It's the one thing is repurposing, but I'm going to quickly go through 3 great tools that you can use to repurpose your podcast really, really quickly. First thing that you can do is you can use an app called Clammr, CLAMMR, to share your podcast in 24-second snippets on social media. It has an inbuilt call to action link that you can take you to the full podcast episode or to your website. You can import your podcast feed from iTunes automatically. You can pick a 24. Actually, anybody can do this. You don't have to be the owner of the podcast. Anybody can select it and share it as well. So listeners can also share it as well. And they can share snippets. If they think they like that last 24 seconds, they can press a button, instantly share it on Twitter or Facebook. But you can also use it as a marketing tool to repurpose your podcast. It actually builds in a little video player with the audio as well, and that shares it natively inline in Twitter and Facebook as well. So it's inline audio in Twitter itself. That gets a lot of people interested, and especially if you use like a little teaser as well from your podcast. So that's the first little tip. Second little tip is if you want to extend your podcast to YouTube automatically, there's a great little tool called tunestotube.com. So you upload your MP3 with an appropriate image, and in one click, you convert the audio into a video, and you just pop in your YouTube channel, and it automatically publishes it there. So that's a real time saver. And lastly, of course, obviously SEO is a big thing in content marketing. You want to also be taking advantage of other forms of marketing. So transcribing your podcast with a service such as gotranscript.com, which is a really cost-effective provider, gets your audio into text. You can post it as show notes along with your podcast episode and your blog. And you're going to be attracting people from the search engines as well, and getting the value of all the text from converting that as well. So my overall tip is really make sure you repurpose the hell out of your podcast as well, because it's not just the audio you can get value from. You can use it. It's so repurposable for podcasts. Absolutely.
Well, those great tips. There's 2 tools there I'm going to go and check out. Great answer to the PS question. Great call. Great podcasting course and a great offer. And just so grateful for you coming on today. And all that remains to say, Simon, is thank you very much. And I wish you all the best of luck with everything in future.
Hey, thanks, Loz. Let's go change the content marketing world and let's get these podcasts started. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me today, Loz. Great to speak to you.
You've been listening to the Content Champion podcast, available at contentchampion.com and on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening.